To another Rodney seminar. My name is Michael Demariam, Director of the African Studies Center here at Boston University. So we're really pleased and excited to welcome Pierre Englebert to join us for today's session. He is the H. Russell Smith Professor of International Relations at Pomona College and also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, as I understand it. And he has published widely on African politics. He's the author of many articles and a number of very significant books, books that have been on my syllabi over the years. Inside African Politics, Africa, Unity, Sovereignty, and Sorrow, and State Legitimacy and Development in Africa. And his work, I would say, is of continental scope, but he's written a lot on Central Africa, the DRC, and the Sahel as well. And I think he'll be talking about some of his recent research on the Sahel. Pierre, thanks for coming, and we look forward to the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Eric, for helping with everything. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I just resigned from the Atlantic Council, so I'm no longer a fellow there, but I was for a few years.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for coming, and I'm really glad to get a chance to do this presentation at this point in time because this research project is really advanced but not finalized, so that we're actually in the stage with my co-author Jessica Piombo from the Naval Postgraduate School. We're at the level where we're starting to write things up. So we've done field work for a few years in Mali, Burkina, and Niger. We've accumulated a lot of material. We think we have some workable hypotheses. And so this is really the perfect time for me to get feedback and to share this where we are and see if it kind of flies, if it works on its own. So this is a Minerva project. So that means we got funding from the Department of Defense to do this big study. It's multiple years. And we are looking at how African states respond, what explains variations in how African states respond to security threats, comparing two countries in the Horn, Ethiopia and Kenya, and then three in the Sahel, Mali, Burkina, and Niger. And so we did the field work and the writing on the Horn earlier, and that's actually coming out this month in Third World Quarterly. And then now we're working on the Sahel part. And by and large, you have this this argument in the African political science scholarship that African states are states that never really had to establish their existence empirically and derive their existence from recognition. And I've worked around that myself. And so some people like Jeffrey Herbst have argued that this really reduced the capacity of the state and that they haven't really gone through this process of kind of fighting for survival. And here we have a bunch of cases where suddenly countries are facing existential threats. I'll elaborate on that in a minute. And so it's a little bit of a test to find out, since they are not all responding the same, what might condition whether some states seem to be more keen to develop capacity to respond to threat, and others seem to be laid back about it or something. So, all right, so let me give you, let me see if this works. So, let me see if I am. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I'm not sure how I did this, but it happened. So, if you look at the countries of the Sahel there, we're really focusing on Mali, Burkina, and Niger. You can see that this is more or less since, this is very recent, but since 2012 or so, the region has been under really significant attack, threats, largely from jihadist insurgents. At first in Mali was separatists, but then it very quickly became local groups and international groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, those kind of actors that have really meted out significant violence against the state, against the security force, against civilian populations, against targets in cities. And the main ones are really, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and then the Islamic State, and then a bunch of more local groups, but that have affiliations with one or the other typically. For example, Katiba Masina is really in the central region of Mali, and it's itself a member of SHNIM, which is the group for the support to Muslims and Islamic faith, and mostly in Burkina and Mali itself. has been pledged allegiance to Al Qaeda. But then you have sometimes international actors like Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has a lot of people coming from Algeria that are really at the root of that group. And then they also recruit locally among these other groups. And then not on the map is Boko Haram, and Boko Haram, as you know, is mostly Nigeria. But if the map continue to eastern Niger, then you would see that in the region of Difa, which is at the very end of Niger and bordering on both Nigeria and Chad, then there's been significant Boko Haram violence. Some of it is just spilling from Nigeria, but there's also been significant action against Niger interest in population. So when you think about this, when I first started working on Africa in the 1980s, I traveled through that whole region. I mean, you could go anywhere. It was very safe and very. I mean, you can't really say that the state was at much reach, but there was no threat. And so, to me, it's always stunning to see how this region, where I remember, roaming around as a young student, has become such a high security environment where there's really severe violence and very significant restrictions to human movement. And so it's really quite a crisis. And those are not strong states to begin with. And they're facing something of historical proportion. Until then, Burkina really had never had anything serious. Mali and Niger had earlier, a little bit in the 1990s and a little bit in the early 2000s, had some insurgencies by Tuareg rebels. In Niger, they were able to co-opt them very much. In Mali, it festered for a long time, and in fact, it made the bed of the jihadist insurgency and created an environment that made it possible for Algerian rebels to kind of move into the region. But otherwise, that whole region was really not under kind of any significant threat. So it's if you can put it in a historical perspective, it's a dramatic deterioration of the conditions in the region. And of course, they all three are former French colonies. They're all part of that French précaré and then the zone of influence. And to some extent, that is part of the story. This is like the soft underbelly of the French empire, post-colonial empire. And some of these groups are really going after the French, and it's no surprise that the French have also responded, been part of the response. So that's kind of the setup. And so here's over time, you can see in the three countries, this is looking at data from ACLED. And here what we do is that often people use casualties from ACLED, but we just look at events. Whether you have like 1 dead, no dead, or 100 dead, you still get an event. And so those are violence by insurgents. And you can see that at first Mali was the only one that had something early on. And then there was the French intervention, it went down, I'll come back over that. And then it flared up again. And then it kind of, there was a process of contagion to a degree, first from Mali to Burkina and then Niger. Now Niger had earlier instance here to around 2015, that's mostly Difa, the region by Nigeria and Boko Haram, but still low numbers. And then since 2018, it's moved, and I'll show all this in a minute, but to a region known as Tillabéri, which is by the border with Mali. So this is all sort of the same violence, the same logic, the same actors, although there are multiple overlapping layers, international actors, local, communal, ethnic. There are many different logics to the violence. But it's part of a kind of a political economy of violence that affects the three countries. And Niger has a little bit less, but it's still very significant numbers. So that's kind of the empirical trigger, the thread that we're looking at. And so then our research question is that given that these countries are facing a similar threat, how do they respond? What kind of response do they put together, if any? And how do these responses vary from a country to another? And if there is such variation, what explains it? And I'm not going to give you the punchline, but there is a lot of variation, and so it gave us really interesting material. And it's important to know, like, this is the selection of kids is very controlled in some ways. They're very similar, right? West Africa, Sahel, that region, former French colonies. Mali and Niger are like 95+% Muslim population. Burkina is a little more heterogeneous, still majority Muslim. Burkina is smaller, otherwise they're very large countries with difficulties, projecting power, really limited resources. So then that's kind of the specific project question. And then to put in context, then we try to find out, if we look at this response, what does it tell us about the politics of these countries, about how the states function, or who the state is, who's behind the state? Why would some of them feel more threatened than others, and be proactive? And then, by and large, where does capacity come from? Because you might want to do something, but you can't always do something. So in the end, even though it's kind of a very security-focused topic, which for me is a new thing. Jessica is a specialist of security sector assistance and scholarship on that. So it was nice for us to work together. For me, it's new, but it certainly is just another window, another angle from where to ask broader questions about statehood that have always been of great interest to me in the continent. And by the way, feel free to stop me any moment if you have a specific question. How do we do this? So we're using data from ACLED. I forget what ACLED stands for. Location, event, data, something. Anyway, they look at data on violence. It's very, very thorough, very complete. And so we identify for the last 21 years, we go all the way to December 31st of the last year, using their data. And we recoded the data, essentially. So it comes very well coded in terms of geolocation, in terms of, is this a bombs in attack? Who's involved, but it doesn't tell you who attacked whom, whether there's response. It's kind of also, it doesn't identify all the groups in terms of their specific nature. Is this like an ethnic militia? Who is it allied with? So it might tell you, here's a group, it's a Fulani militia, and here's a group that's a Mosi militia. And in fact, the Fulani militia is associated with the jihadists, and the other one with the state. So you kind of have to know these things. So then we look at, are you a state ally? Are you the state? Are you a foreigner? We just code all these different dimensions. And then by looking at the narratives, we said who attacks whom and who responds. Because for us, if there's a violence between the jihadists and the state, it makes a big difference who initiates, because we're interested in state response. So if the state initiates, that's a response. If the state is on the receiving end, it's very different. So we recoded it. And so that's kind of the empirical foundation. And then we're also looking at assessments of the country's capacity from outsiders. And one source here that we have, but I'll skip that today because it's a little bit long, but it's in the PowerPoint, so I'm glad to share that. We look at these assessments by the State Department on the efforts of, they have annual reports on the effort of other countries in the fight against terror. And so it will tell you, like, the Malians this, the Burkinabe this, and then you have these patterns. So we go through all these narratives, 20 years of them, and then we kind of identify the themes and the assessments. And that gives us actually variation that matches very nicely the data. And then we did field work in the 3 countries. And we did mostly interviews with people in the security sector, people in the military, in the gendarmerie, police, government, state actors, and some outside people who work with them, foreign, like the European training mission in Bamako and stuff like that, and Kulikuro and things like that. So the idea is to kind of get an assessment and a sense of the nature of the response. So that's kind of the background. All right, so the project is broad, and we're looking at response at the level of security per se, like, fighting. We're looking at, how does the state respond in terms of institutional manifestation? Does it kind of, deepen its institutional fabric as a response? Does it create new institutions? What's the political response in terms of stability or strength, and economic response? So then here we haven't really done a lot of work with what we have so far. And here we have some sort of hypothesis, some preliminary impressions. But today I'll just focus on the first one, which is really where we've done the most of the work and we're the furthest ahead. But the project is broader than that. And by and large, the basic variation is this, that in Mali, you have a phenomenon of delegation, where the Malian government essentially lets other actors perform violence and respond to threats. And it's very much hands-off in a way. And then at the other extreme, you have Niger, where there's mostly state action by itself with limited cooperation with outside actors, mostly foreign intervention, foreign interveners, but not local, not domestic, non-state actors. And then in Burkina, you have, it's in between. with some dimension like Niger, and the use of local militias much more than Niger, but an attempt at integrating them as opposed to like in Mali where they say okay go ahead and do the business yourself. Here there's like let's see to what extent we can work with you. So there's a response that the state is somewhat delegated, but the state is cooperating with non-state actors and trying to keep them under state control to a degree. So there's interesting variation. Now, if you look at the actual data, this is kind of the summary of the finding that needs to be explained, if you will. And I'll go into more details of what's behind all this. But here we look at three different possible actors to summarize. There's also possibilities of actors working together. But either it's the state itself, and by the state I mean like the military, gendarmerie, police, any kind of the garde forestier, whatever, all sorts of actors that are official state actors. And then we look at foreign interveners, and that can be the UN, it can be France, it can be Chad, but essentially other governments or governmental organizations. And then we look at non-state local actors, and they tend to be self-defense groups, ethnic militias, communal militias. And so you can see that in blue is the state, and you can see how in Niger the response is almost a monopoly of the state. And Burkina is close to that, but has a little more variety. Mali is really quite different. Mali, the state is a minority partner in the production of its own security, if you will. And then you have a very large role for foreign actors. With a lot of things happening right now, this project ends in 2021, but it can inform some of the current news. And you know that the French have left to a degree, and the Russians have moved in. But it's kind of noise from the perspective of the way Mali does things. It's one or the other, sort of. And then the use of militias, or the fact that militias are doing a lot of actions on their own without working with the state in certain regions. So it's like about a third each. In Burkina, the state is more preponderant, but very large role for militias. And some of these militias have become state actors, so there's kind of overlap there. And then in Niger, it's much more the state. And the militias, they're a little bit misleading. In fact, it should really be almost nothing. Some of these militia actions there, this is all in percentage of the total. Some of those, when you look at the data from ACLED, they're actually Malian militias who crossed into Niger and are coded with Niger. But if you look at the breakdown, then you realize, oh, this is not a local dynamic. They might be in pursuit against some groups. In 2018, briefly, with the violence starting in the Tillabéri region, the Niger authorities considered working with some local militias, and then walked away from that. So there's a brief window there in the data. There's a peak around that time. It's still very limited. And half of that has to be imputed to Mali, and the other half is that field experiment. Now they're adamant about the fact that they don't want militias. And they say, no, we learned a lesson earlier with the Tuareg insurgency in 2007, 2008, and the fact that the ethnic militias became a problem. So, of course, you can say that. That doesn't mean that you're able to replace them with something else. So that's kind of part of the question we're looking at. We don't want to fool around with the data, so we leave it there. Once you look at it, it's like, okay, it's actually a little, it should be even more blue, but you can start tweaking things, and then eventually it becomes problematic whether you read what you want in it, right? All right, so to look a little more at the details, so this is the Mali situation, right? So mostly non-Malian state actors. International and internationally, it's mostly the French. MINUSMA is there too. MINUSMA is a UN mission in Mali. MINUSMA mostly shows up on the receiving end of violence. Right? You have attacks against MINUSMA. It's very rare that you have an event where MINUSMA is the one acting. So it really kind of makes you, when you look at the data over time, it really makes you wonder what the point of MINUSMA is largely, and whether MINUSMA does anything else but protect itself. And I think it's in a very difficult situation. And of course, it was sent there for a very different conflict, and things change around it. And then there really hasn't been an adjustment, because they're still there to kind of implement the 2015 Algiers peace agreement, which is all about the separatists, which is kind of yesterday's conflict. And then you have these militias. And so here I want to elaborate on that. This is kind of an interesting thing. So we have the military, and the military in Mali, as you know, there's been several coups over the last few years. So the military in Mali is very much protecting itself, and the Malian political class is very much protecting itself in general. you have this delegation to others, and then in Bamako you have this sense. You talk to people, you interview. There's this kind of feeling that you're in Versailles while Paris is burning or something. Like it's this is party time, and we're fine. We're far away from this. It's really a sense of not a strong sense of responsibility about what's happening, and no obvious visible behavioral adjustment given the crisis. And so the coups there are largely coups that the military does to protect itself and to improve its lot, or to complain about the lack of support that they get. But they're much more focused on corporatist strategies of enhancement of their situation versus responding to the violence way out there. And so then they use other groups. So in the north, for example, in the region near Kidal, between I'll show you in a minute, but not far from the border with Niger, there also there's a group of Tuaregs there. The Tuaregs are a very socially structured society, and so the Tuaregs who are typically associated with the separatism, and also now some of the jihadist groups, tend to be from a specific group of more nobility, and then the Imgad can be for more as maybe commoners, tend to be on the side of the state. Historically, they benefit in terms of their own social advancement from being on the side of the state, since they are socially cadet to the other ones, but they're all citizens equally. So it's advantageous for this group. And so they have their own militia, and that's doing a lot of stuff on behalf of the state in that region. And then you have other Tuaregs who signed the peace agreement of 2015 and call themselves the platform, so they renounce separatism, and they also still very active in the region against the jihadists. And then you have, the Dozo, the Dogon, a bunch of other groups have their own militias. This is a Dogon militia group, and they operate mostly now in the middle region of the country, where the violence has spread over the last few years. That's where the Dogon live, around the Mopti region, which is majority Peul, Fulani, but the Peul have this awkward, ambiguous relationship with the jihadists. Most Peuls, of course, have nothing to do with it, but many of the jihadists in that region are Peul, and so then they get associated with it. So other groups then tend to see the need to develop self-defense groups against these other groups. It quickly turns into communal violence, because it overlaps with issues, access to land. The Peul tend to be somewhat nomadic. The other guys are farmers, and there's significant demographic pressure and significant climatic pressure. And so, and with the state being largely absentee, communities resort to violence often to adjudicate disputes about access to resource, to water, to land, and things like that. So that's part of this overlapping thing. But the state not only tolerates, but really counts on some of these groups to get the job done. And then you have the foreign actors. There's a lot of them. You have MINUSMA, of course. And then until a few months ago, you had Barkhane, the French operation, which started in 2013 at Serval, and then became abroad. The Barkhane was for the whole region, the Sahel, but still a lot of troops in France. So then after the coup, the most recent coup, the French got somewhat frustrated with the Malians and vice versa. And then the situation deteriorated to the point that the French left. And so Barkhane still exists, but it's reshuffling. And just last week, Niger voted to agree to have more French troops based in Niger. So some of them are moving to Niger. Takuba was a European Union task force, which the French kind of also invented as a way to share responsibility with others, and that's also fallen apart as a result of the coup and the sour politics in Bamako and then the relations with France. The EUTM is a training mission based in Kulikoro that's been existing also since 2013, and I think if you look at the numbers, they've trained more than the total number of troops of members of the Malian armed forces. So everybody apparently has been trained. But they don't track what happens to them afterwards. So, and I think that might be ending too. G5 is this task force, joint task force of the Chad, Mauritania, and then there are 3 countries here. And in Mali, and in those 3 countries, whenever you have G5 operation, it's usually Chad in either by itself or with the local state. Chad is really quite, when you look at ACLED, you can see how Chad projects power and violence quite successfully and far away from home. Chad, lots of Chad operations into Mali, into Burkina. And then you have Russia's Wagner, which, you know, I was recently on a Zoom talk with, it was a bunch of people from, it was the German Marshall Fund who organized it. And it was some European diplomats and some US folks from the state and even the National Security Council. And they wanted to stress the transatlantic dialogue about the Sahel. And so a couple of academics were invited to participate. And all they could talk about was Russia. And, you know, this is so often the case that in DC people think of Africa only through the lens of, you know, is it China, is it whatever, right? And so here suddenly nobody was talking about China. It's all about Russia and how can we tolerate this. For me, I feel like, well, you know, it's the same pattern. French, the EU, the Russians, they'll go, whoever wants to do it for them, they'll go to you. And the Russians are definitely willing to do it for them in terms of fighting and killing people much more than the other ones were willing to do. So I just read today in Le Monde that one of the jihadist groups claimed they had caught one of the Wagner Russian guys. It wasn't confirmed, they had no evidence. But it would be interesting to see what happens if they start getting on the receiving end of the violence. So anyway, this is kind of a pattern. And if you look at Mali over time, this is not really that surprising because Mali has a long history of surviving as a state by delegating significant dimensions of statehood to others, particularly in times of crisis. So the only kind of real crisis you had before were the droughts of the 70s and 80s when, you know, the state was really in the road. And if you look at the work of Gregory Mann, I put his book cover there, From Empires to NGOs in the West African Sahel. He speaks of non-governmentality. But that book there's a great example showing how groups like Oxfam and international agencies and NGOs really took the slack and took over the performing of statehood and the maintenance of state services during significant periods over a very large amount of land. And so it's not a different pattern from what you see now. It's this idea that, you know, we don't have the resource, we don't have the capacity, and there's no obvious effort at building that capacity. There might not really be a possibility to really build it given local resources. And so Mali has tended to default to a pattern of letting others take care of things. Even when ATT, Amadou Toumani Touré, was president, which was like 2002 to 2012 or something like that, there was already significant issue with the Tuaregs in the north, and his kind of arrangement was to, you know, do some patronage that, okay, you guys take care of it amongst yourself, I'll give you some resources. But it was a pattern of security decentralization, if you will. That's also a pattern of farming out and delegating. So when I look at this literature over time, I was not that surprised with the findings that we have on Mali. It still begs the question of why, right? And so now looking at the other ones in Burkina, the state is much more dominant, and you have a little bit with, you know, foreign actors, but mostly the other ones would be the militias. And it's worth looking at this. So these domestic actors, also in Burkina, you just had a coup. So it's a little bit of the pattern of Mali, where the coup came after a bunch of gendarmes, a bunch of military people in the north were butchered by the insurgents in December or November of last year. And so the Burkinabe military responded and got rid of the president and the state, essentially by saying, you know, you're not protecting us. The story is that these guys were killed when they ventured out of their bases. They were waiting to be resupplied with things, and so they had no food. And so they went out there. They went out to hunt and to feed themselves, and then they were caught and killed. And so they say, you know, it can't be that the state doesn't take better care of us when we're out there on the front line. So again, the military got rid of the political actors to protect itself, if you will. And so it's a little bit the same pattern as you see in Mali. Then you have these interesting groups. This is the Mosi are the main ethnic group in Burkina, and the one at the core really of politics. And so since about, this existed a long time, but since about 2015, there's been a resurgence of this communal, traditional hunter society. It really means, I think the word Kogo means guardians of the forest. And they are essentially local self-defense security groups that work at the village level, and usually in groups of 10 or something like that. There's a process of endorsement by the village chief. You can't just set up a Kogo, you have to be legitimated by the chief, and so they've become a very significant actor in terms of security, largely in the region that borders with the east, the Gumanche region, where there's violence, and then in the north of the Mosi area, where it comes close to where the other violence is. I'll show you the map in a minute too. The interesting thing here is that, so you have this group, but the government has tried to work with them. And so they are autonomous, and they've done some exactions. The government has not condemned, trying to be careful with them. But the government also in 2020 passed a law to set up the Volunteers for the Defense of the Fatherland, which is a volunteer group, essentially telling people, hey, our armed forces are weak, just join a volunteer organization, and we'll give you some weapons, and we'll train you for 2 weeks, and we'll give you a monthly stipend, and we'll pay the stipend by group of 10 or 12. And so essentially it was a way of saying, asking the Kogo Wiogo to register, if you will, to become part of this thing. Some of them did, and some of them it works well for them. Others, when they do that, they tend to lose local legitimacy, and then it leads to scission, where you have new groups claiming, no, we're the real ones, and you guys are some sort of state, looking for state handouts. And so it creates some internal dynamic that's interesting, and that Lauren is starting to study. I don't know a lot about that, but it's really fascinating. But to me, what's interesting is that it's not quite the same as Mali. You do have these groups, but the state in Burkina still has an intention to control them. So the state is willing to dilute itself a little bit into them, but not to surrender the action, the space, the agency to them altogether. And then you have a little bit of international, again, Chad and Barkhane, but actually much less when you look at the data. And then in Niger, really the state is the main one. And the militias, again, are mostly some Tuareg action that came from Mali. A little bit of international action shared with other actors, and Chad. Chad works a lot with Niger. I didn't identify over that whole period of time a single action, a single event where Chad was by itself. Anytime Chad was involved, it was with joint operation with the Niger military. So the will to be in charge is important. And when we were there doing interviews, that's what everybody told us. We are not surrendering territory. We have emptied some bases that were attacked, and we abandoned those bases, but we moved to mobile units, and we're still in that region. Early, we abandoned some village in the Difa region. We told people to get away from by the Lake Chad there. Last year, they sent people back to these regions. They repopulate. They say, no, we don't want to do this. And so, by and large, the state is responding in a manner that says we are under duress, we're struggling, but we are not renouncing our monopoly of violence. We're not renouncing our territorial sovereignty. We are trying to reaffirm it. So you have some Barkhane, some G5, but mostly the Niger armed forces, and they haven't had a coup. Although, you know, when the current President Bazoum took over, it was in 2020. Right before it took over, there was a coup attempt. So maybe it's luck that they haven't had a coup, that they just foiled it. It could have turned out different. But by and large, you can see the difference in like the degree of I don't know how to call it, professionalism, responsibility. Bazoum often comes out and he will blame literally, like he will tell these people in Bamako are not serious. You know, they're like, what do they do when they have such a big crisis? They just like overthrow the government, and he really disses his counterparts. And then he makes a point of displaying a type of statehood that's much more responsible. Just recently, he went to Parliament to get an authorization for the French troops to be deployed in Niger. I thought that he really needed to do that for them to come, but he wants to show functional statehood in the middle of crisis. And you know, by the rather weak standards of the Sahel, they do deliver. And then what you notice, what's interesting, in Niger, you had this, the state is almost growing through the process. So there's a bunch of institutions, the Conseil National d'Études Stratégiques, the High Authority for Peace. They've created a bunch of state agencies that are tasked with either developing a military strategic response, like doing proper military planning. They didn't have that before. Devising a strategy, implementing the strategy, think about recruitment, that's the CNESS. And then you have the High Authority, l'autorité pour la paix.
Consolidation de la paix.
What?
The consolidation of
For la consolidation, yeah. And that dates back to the era of the Tuareg insurgency, but it's been revitalized. It's actually a Tuareg general who's in charge of it. And so they're deploying their efforts in Tillabéri region right now. And that group tries to do mediation, tries to do all sorts of actions, projects, development projects, short-term intervention, high-impact things. And they also appoint people. So we met with the director there, and they recruit local civilians whom they ask to inform about the local conditions and to give them like early warning things. So you see the state here penetrating society and trying to reinforce its presence as a response. Really, when you think of the logic of this, it's really the opposite of what the Malians are doing. Now, you don't want to read too much into it because this is all happening at a fairly weak level of capacity. So it's not like, I don't want to paint this like, as this is like the Pentagon, boom. Not that the Pentagon has always capacity, but still, it's on the shoestring. But it's really interesting, the different logic. And then they make it very clear they do not want militias. They're afraid of falling into this pattern of interethnic conflict. So here I'll skip all this. This is the work based on the reports, this theories, but the story is very consistent, and by all means I'll be glad to share these slides. So let me go to. Do you understand the basic empirical variation, the dependent variable? I made that clear, right? So then the next question becomes, how do we explain this? And here, this is where we are. We try to think of the state beyond its territorial, institutional, neutral existence. You can say Mali, Niger, Burkina, they're all three states, and they all look the same in some ways. But then there's politics below the state. And you can think of it in terms of, some scholars talk of political settlements, like, what kind of coalition is in charge. You can think of it in terms of social contract, like who is part to the creation of the state. You can think of it in terms of political economy or ownership, right? Some groups are always more privileged in terms of access to the state. Whose state is it? Right? And clearly, if you're Tuareg in Mali, it's not your state. Right? So we're trying to find out, where does the violence take place, and who are the groups that are historically, contemporarily, traditionally the ones who own the state, who are the most included, and how are they affected by the violence? And our hypothesis is that you can tolerate violence if it doesn't threaten your core interests. So it looks like it's existential to the state, and you can say, look, Mali, 2/3 of Mali is like gone. Yeah, but to some extent, that might not really be fundamentally threatening to some population in Mali. Right? Maybe in Niger, you get a very different reaction because the region that's threatened is much more connected to people who are associated with the state. So that's kind of the basic idea. We got this idea really. I did a lot of work on the DRC over the years, and in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, since the early 1990s, there's been violence nonstop in the east. And at some point it was very high level, but it's always there. There's about 80 different armed groups operating to this day in both Kivus, in Ituri, and North Katanga, Tanganyika. And by and large, the government in Kinshasa will say, oh, we need to do something. Recently, for example, they let the Rwandans again go and take care of it to a degree. But by and large, they can live with it. It hasn't, if you're in Kinshasa, it's not a big threat. The diamonds and the copper come from a different region. And in fact, you can send a lot of troops out there, a lot of generals who are not in Kinshasa, and that's not bad news. And a lot of people are doing very well out of it. There's a political economy of war. You make a lot of money out there with the violence. Politicians have their local militias that they can use to create trouble, and that they can then sell that trouble, if you will, to get influence. So you have a system whereby it's quite tolerable for a regime to lose control over some of its territory. And so we wondered if maybe we could make sense of it this way too. So the two things, the two dimensions, we look at population, that's the one I just stressed, and then we also try to see where does the money come from for these governments. You can't function without resources. These are all very aid-dependent countries, but still, government revenue comes first and foremost domestically. And so here, I don't have anything to show for you yet, but we have some hypothesis and some preliminary sense that maybe there's something there. One of the challenges that, at least in Mali and Burkina, gold is a big source of revenue for the government. And there's a few formal mines, but there's a lot of artisanal mining. And that makes it a little bit hard to locate clearly whether the resource is associated with a specific region and specific group and things like that. But we're working our way through that. But the basic idea is this: in Mali and Burkina, you have some gold and cotton. And a lot of that appears to be away from where the violence is. So the government can still extract its resources despite the violence. In Niger, the main resource is uranium, and uranium is in Arlit, which is Tuareg territory. And that currently is not part of the region where there's violence. Violence is in Tilaberi, which is mostly Peul, and Zerma, and it's in Difa, which is not Hausa, but related groups. But to get the uranium from Arlit, to get the resource, it travels by road. So it goes down. I should really show you a map. I guess this one doesn't work. Let me go a little bit ahead and show a map. Wrong country. So the Arlit is around here, and this is Tuareg. The green is Tuareg. But the uranium comes down by trucks and goes all the way to Niamey, and then goes down through Benin. So the resource itself, even though it's located there, the resource is exported, and the revenue is accrued through a geographical encounter with the rest of the country, and so the violence becomes significant. We have this is just like me giving you an intuitive thing here because we haven't dug deeper into that, but that would be one of the two dimensions. The one I want to stress here is the notion of core versus peripheral, included versus excluded, honors of the state versus marginalized population. These states have historically been produced through a process where some groups have taken control of the state. And so if you look at Mali first, right? So here's the distribution of ethnic groups. And you want to be careful, of course, you don't want to fall into like a simplistic ethnic analysis of politics. But there's no doubt that there is an ethnic layer. And even though we don't want to simplify or primordialize it, it is part of the logic of violence, and this is the way people think about it too. The violence is mostly located in the region that is populated by the Tuareg up here. There's also some Arab and some other groups there, some Songhai. And then here, the Peul, Fulani, Fulfulde, whatever you want to call them. That's where most of the violence is now. So that means in the Mopti region, Gao, Kidal, Tombouctou. So if you look there in blue is Mopti. You can see how the violence in Mopti has really gone up. Up there in brown above it is actually Ségou. So now it's like, you can see recently it's increased. So that's kind of the process of spreading a little bit, which also, by the way, corresponds to this kind of the response moving away from France and to the Russians, who are maybe more willing to do fighting. The French Barkhane was mostly up there. And so this might be a response as it threatens, as it comes further south. And then down there in orange is Kidal, that region here. So those are the regions that are mainly affected by the violence, right? And so who lives there? These people. And these people have a relation to the state that's peripheral. The post-colonial country of Mali is deeply anchored in the south. The population here is much broader. And here these populations have a lot of similarities. You have Bambara, Malinke, Mandinge, people who are Soninke, Senufo, people who share a lot of characteristics. There are subsets of kind of broadly related groups. And then, of course, you have this whole notion of the historical state, the empire, the Mali Empire. And the Mali Empire did reach up to Timbuktu and it reached further out. But really, it was anchored here among these populations and other groups to Ghana, Mali, all these political formations that existed before, and that are a big part of the narrative of statehood in Mali. I mean, to the point that they've chose that name, right? This is really French Sudan, right? But then when they became independent, they united with Senegal and called it the Federation of Mali. That broke up after a few months, and they kept the name of Mali, this pre-colonial reference. It's a reference that makes some sense because it gives you this kind of grounding outside of being a post-colony, but it's an exclusionary reference because other groups were not part of that, or even had a difficult relationship, or there was historical violence among these groups, right? So the Mali Empire actually fell apart under the assault of Gao and groups from up there. So there's, people speak of whether there's resources. People say, oh, there is oil there, there's uranium, this stuff, but there's no active exploitation of anything here. And there are populations who are at the periphery of the social contract. And by and large, it corresponds with the fact that the population in the south are, the political elites are able to, quote unquote, ignore it or live with it because it really doesn't threaten them. It doesn't really go threaten their constituents and their groups that you can sort of live without. Now, clearly, here you do have more farming and things like that. In the Dogon, a group that's more associated with the state, as sedentary. And so, as it spreads closer, the response is a little stronger, but it tends to be also delegations. Okay, you guys, you work for us, you take care of it, but we are not going to directly commit as many troops as we could otherwise. Now, again, as I'm saying, we're like in the middle of putting this together, looking at our evidence or different stuff. It seems that there's a story there. I'm very eager to see whether you think it's plausible. Those of you who know the region, whether we're missing something, it's the right timing to get this kind of feedback. So I'm just giving this to you as a preliminary finding, if you will. Same thing in Burkina. If you look at the violence there, the provinces that have the most violence are the Sahel and the Centre Nord, and then the East. Those are the ones there in brown and in green. And who lives there? Again, Pearl, same thing, same population, Fulani, Pearl, Tuareg, and here the Gumanche. And in Burkina, the Mossi have 50+% of the population. And the Mossi are the ones, all presidents except for Lamizana were Mossi, or Senkai or Silmi Mossi have. But the Mossi are politically really dominant group. The Moro Naba, the emperor of the Mossi, is headquarters in Ouagadougou. The contemporary state is anchored in the same space as the Mossi traditional, and the military is very Mossi dominated, the officers, etc. So here the resources, this is the richer region agriculturally. There's no very clear, there's some gold in the north, so we're not sure where to go with that. But in terms of the population, you also have groups that are historically at the periphery. The Gumanche have always been a much more marginalized group. The Pearl and Tuareg, same thing. Now, the violence here is a little more, Waiguya, that region, the violence is going all the way into the Boucle du Mouhoun, so you can see that it's affecting some other groups here. And it certainly is part of this is an area, of course, the world is not like this, right? You have overlapping everywhere. But in this region up here, where you have Mossi and Pearl largely, the violence is happening there. It's actually moving down even below Kaya at points. Right? So this might explain why there's a little bit of a stronger response, because at least, even though you're not really in Ouaga, there is some significant threat of the Mossi core interest. And so then you have the weak state responding by working with the Mossi militia and trying to still partner with it as opposed to entirely delegating to it, because really the state and these groups are very close to each other. At some point last year or 2 years ago, there was some village chief was killed, a Mossi village chief, and then the Kogel Wilgo went and killed 60 people in a village, Fulani Pearl people. And the government, the prime minister, didn't say anything. And by and large, people say, they're the same, and so you can't really expect them to hold them accountable, because this is kind of the silent contract between them. Now, if you look at Niger, the violence, so here's Tillabéri, so there's a lot of violence here, and then here's Difa, and there's been historical violence there. So in orange down there is Difa. No, I'm sorry, in orange is Tillabéri. Right? No, orange is Difa, I apologize. In blue is Tillabéri. So Difa, you can see there was the bump in 2015-16, Boko Haram. And then there's more violence now, and then in the blue region, the Tillabéri region, is the more recent violence. Now, first of all, you can see that this is very close to Niamey, And who lives here? There's a mix of people here. You have Zerma Songhai, who are really the politically most influent group, and also Peul who live there. So there's the issue of the uranium, but there's also the fact that in Niger you have this interesting phenomenon where it's kind of a country of peripheral communities. The Hausa who live here, they're actually demographically the biggest group, 50 plus, but politically they haven't been dominant. And of course, the kind of the periphery of the Hausa down here in Nigeria, right? And the Zerma Songhai, Gao here is a big Songhai region. And then the Tuareg live in the whole region. So you have the sense that you don't have that kind of core group. The French started in Hausa land, and then they moved the border, they moved the capital to where Niamey is, which is more in Germa area, partly to kind of weaken the Hausa. So you have, the Zerma Songhai are a dominant group with still 20% of the population. And since democratization in the 1990s, they have had much lesser representation than other groups. So the state seems more widely shared. After the insurgencies of 2007-8, the peace agreement they came up with the Tuareg had a lot of integration of the Tuareg into the armed forces. The prime minister from 2011 to 2021 was a Tuareg. For 10 years of a Tuareg. It's not like some sort of token role. So Niger, having a lot of smaller communities, responded, I think, by integrating, co-opting people into the state. To this day, with the current violence, they're trying to recruit. They realize they have a deficit of Peul in the military, and so they're actually actively seeking to recruit Peul. And they're also changing even electoral circumscription to increase the amount of Peul who could be elected and represented in the state. So it's kind of a very different view, if you will. So it looks like there might be a story there. In some ways, the story is a little bit elementary in terms of like ethnic groups, but I'm kind of making it simpler here, the way I present it. But by and large, it's one about understanding who's in the state. And eventually, the state is people, and so people have differential rate of access and control of the state. And identity is a big variable in the salience of access to the state. So we do think it's actually quite potentially significant. So now if you look at, just to reinforce the evidence, this is from Johan Ricard Hugel, this really interesting work. I don't know if you know him, but he's this young scholar. I think isn't he at Maryland? Maybe.
What's the name?
Ricard Hugel. He might be at Loyola, Maryland or something like that. So anyway, he does really interesting work. And here what he did, he looked at, I think it's like a 40 or 50 year period of time. He looks at the regional origin of ministers. And so the darker the color, the more ministers. So you can see that in Mali, historically, more members of the government come from the south. And then up there in the north is a result of some co-optation under ATT, but it's kind of a blimp. In Burkina, you can see that dark blue, that's a Mossi country kind of, and then the west also. And in Niger, you have the Zerma Songhai Tillabéri region, but there's also the Hausa, some other groups. So this is really not, it doesn't count as empirical evidence, but it counts as kind of hunch evidence. Being tenured, I can just do that. Sorry. Anyway, so that's where we are. So the tentative conclusion is that variations in security response might correlate with the extent to which violence affects core state constituents. And some actors can live with peripheral violence. It can bring resource, and it might be rational to apply different degrees of statehood. You don't need to project. You don't need to take. It's really a lot of effort, a lot of resource, a lot of work to actually try to be a variant state. And so why not decentralize security and let others do it for you? So that's what we have. I don't know if, I hope I didn't take too long, but I'm eager to hear your feedback. So thank you for paying attention.
Great question.
I'm going to sneak out in a moment, Pierre, but
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that really interesting talk. I really appreciated seeing the dependent variable, the variation on it, thinking about the three countries separately, because I hadn't really reflected on it in that way before. And so I think that that variation is very compelling, the way you presented it. One thing that came to mind, this isn't a question, it's a comment, is that the way that in Burkina, we see this sort of collaboration with the armed actors, the non-state actors in relation to the Kolweogo. It reminded me, it brought to mind this sort of this widespread belief that Blaise Compaoré was in an alliance with the jihadists, and that the reason that there wasn't violence during his reign was because of that. And it just, I wonder if there's something there that's worth thinking about in terms of sort of informal institutions or informal practices in relation to whether it's appropriate to sometimes collaborate, even when the non-state actors are perpetuating violence. So just something that came to mind. But thank you for that presentation.
Thank you for that feedback. It's interesting. So I think that there is some evidence that Compaoré did that, in the sense that he tried to make himself useful to these groups so that he could stay in good relations with them. And so he had a lot of them come to Ouaga and do the negotiation in their business there. And he tried to also help solve some hostage crisis by having contacts with them, which also gave him maintain currency with the West and things like that. So it's a little bit like what ATT did in Mali for a while. And so that's interesting. It is actually it is a form of decentralized security, an informal security system. Yeah, so I'll think about that. So I think in that period, the period we're looking at, because the violence started much later in Burkina, we're looking at the post-Compaoré period, effectively. Even though we have data from 2020, from 2000 to 2021, there really is nothing of significance in Burkina until way later. So we don't have anything from that period that in our analysis. The fact that there was no violence might be because to some extent it was working. And when he was overthrown, the whole security apparatus collapsed, and his presidential guard was disbanded. And so then the current regime found itself very weakened in terms of security response, and then the Kolweogo became much more appealing in that sense. Thank you, yeah. And I look forward to staying in touch about your research on that too. Thanks for coming.
If I can just add to that, was sort of the intention that a lot of people in Niger had as well. Like friends sort of joking, the government they're taking the anti-terrorism money from the EU, and they're taking the money from the jihadists as well to kind of stabilize everything. But I just wanted to add that we have a question here on Zoom as well.
All right.
So Mamoudou, please go ahead.
Muted.
Yeah, you're still muted. There we go.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I am from Mali, so you understand that I am an insider. So I would like to point out two things before I ask my question. In your presentation, you call Dozo as an ethnic group. This is a mistake. Dozo means hunter in Bamanankan. It's not an ethnic group. It's just a militia, let me put it this way. The second thing, again, semantics. You call the management of a security situation in Mali as delegation, state delegation. Here, I would like to point out something that I think is very important. You see, we have international actors, such as MINUSMA, Barkhane. Before Barkhane, it was called Serval. If you put them together, they make 18,000 foreign troops that were called in the country to stabilize the situation. But since 2012, the situation gets worsening year after year, despite strong presence of different stakeholders. That's the reason why sometimes you need to ask the question, why are we getting so much foreign troops when the situation is getting worse? If you look at the root causes of the crisis in Mali, you said it started in 2012. You did not go far into the root causes. 2012 is the starting point in Mali, but before 2012, we have 2011, when Gaddafi was toppled in Libya. This is the starting moment, the turning point. Rebels from Libya, they came back to Mali. And this is when things started. I would like to point this and know what is your take, because I see here there is a causal effect between the removal of Gaddafi and the worsening situation of security worsening situation in Mali and in the region in general. Yes, the picture is different from country to country. Mali is worse, but still we have the same problem in Niger. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Mamoudou, is that? Yeah, thank you. I apologize for the Dodo thing. The slide puts them at the same level as with the Dogon, which is an ethnic group. I didn't mean to say it was an ethnic group, but things got jumbled together. So I appreciate you clarified that. I apologize. I don't know if to what extent it matters for what we actually are looking at. So we're trying to understand variation in the response. I don't know. So I mentioned 2012 because that's kind of when the insurgency starts in Mali. You're right that the insurgency starts because the Tuaregs from Gaddafi, from Libya, have returned, and that triggers things. You know, very quickly, these Tuaregs get sidelined by actors that are much more associated with Algeria and with the jihadist insurgencies there, kind of outmuscle them in the region. I don't know to what extent that dimension matters a lot for us. One way or the other, you have the threat and then you have the state response. However, the fact that the Tuaregs went to Mali as opposed to Niger, you know, the Nigerian government was actually very keenly following them as these groups. If you look at the map from Libya to northern Mali, you kind of go at the edge of the Niger territory, and they could have stayed there. This is a Tuareg population. From what we've heard, the government was much more proactive in making sure they would not settle there or disarming them or responding. So there might have been already an explanation that's consistent with what we see now in suggesting why things got worse in terms of the violence earlier in Mali. But in the end, whether it starts early or it spreads later, from our perspective, and I understand what you mean, there is significant variation there. But from our perspective, it's less crucial when it starts or where it starts first, as opposed to the fact that it's there and how the government responds. Now, it's possible that you learn from the experience of others, and so the timing might matter to a degree. But yeah, I appreciate those thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Is there someone?
Yeah.
There was his question about why, after foreign forces, they became war. I don't know.
Yeah. So the violence worsened. So people wonder, right? So what happened also is that the violence moved. So you have MINUSMA. MINUSMA is 12 people out of these 18. And MINUSMA is stuck in camps largely in the north. And so you can't really expect, I mean, MINUSMA is also a peacekeeping operation, right? So they're unlikely to be able to fight insurgents. They're there to really help enforce a peace agreement that's really flawed, right? So then they're really a mismatch with the situation. And then you have trainers, then you have the French. So some people suspect, not just in Mali, but across the region, that really they're not trying hard and that they have their own advantage. And then, you know, why would the French not be able to defeat these groups? I don't really go for these conspiracy theories, but I do think that the violence has moved. And so MINUSMA is there for one thing, but that thing is no longer relevant. And that they don't really have a mandate for the jihadis. The jihadis are not even part of the treaty. So then the violence moved actors, but also moved region. It moved to Mopti, it moved to northern Burkina, it moved to Difa. Well, MINUSMA is not there. So you have Barkhane. Barkhane really works in the tri-border region, but Barkhane doesn't work down south where the Katiba Masina is. So some of the violence might be in response to what they see as more imperial projection of the West, and some of it is like the problem spreading out of the control of these slow military response that tend to be a little bit rigid and bulky in how they deploy. So, but I don't study that part directly, so that's what comes to mind. I'm sorry, so you had a question?
Yeah, so kind of thinking this, anyway, thank you. This was a really interesting
Thank you.
presentation at the beginning. But so thinking about, your kind of tentative conclusions, it seems like I think it's really compelling, but one thing I was thinking of is like when you talked about the local incentives in terms of governing how the state is deciding whether people are still kind of core constituents, it seems like it would be helpful to think through and sort of make more explicit talking about the potential for coup, right? Like the Mali coup situation where you can justify it by seeing a kind of maybe insufficient state response to violence as can become justification. So the governments are obviously trying to avoid coups. So like thinking about in terms of like the maps you were talking about, obviously with Niger you have a much closer to the capital violence, which necessitates a closer kind of more immediate or more direct state response. But then in Mali, maybe you had like you said, delegation, but then the delegation also opens the door to coup and to a threat to the government itself. So it seems like thinking, like maybe making more explicit the importance of governments avoiding coups can kind of help to explain what these, like the differentiation in the response to violence.
That's a great suggestion. It's a really good point. We talked about it, but we haven't really found a way to bring that in, but we need to. Because if you look for, so maybe in Burkina it was too late, but there was a coup. But if you look first, there was this killing of these gendarmes in November or December, and then you see the president goes on TV like at 11 p.m. like he really responds because people are in the streets demonstrating. They're so upset that the government essentially let the soldiers starve to death and then force them to go out and get killed. Now suddenly something that was a faraway threat becomes a government threat because people are protesting, and then there's always the chance that the military will take over these protests. And it did happen. But at first, the government responds, and he fired his prime minister, he reshuffled the government, he went on TV to say, no, I understand you. He was really trying to address things. And so you could see that, okay, now suddenly there's a risk to him in Ouaga because of the potential for coup, right? Exactly. So I need to find a way to bring that into the model, but I think it's totally correct.
Yeah, and then I kind of jumping off that too. Like the other thing is the importance of, in terms of thinking about this variation in who can kind of have more influence on the state, the importance of the capital. Because like when you were talking about the GRC case, I've been doing some ethnographic research in Congo the last couple of years. And one thing that's really striking there is when you think about the état de siège, it's very, at least from my sense, it's very popular in Kinshasa, but very unpopular in the actual, in Kivus where it's actually affecting people. But the state seems like, well, it depends obviously on the ethnic coalition and who's in power and stuff, but like what the sort of people in the capital are thinking and perceive to be like the problem, quote unquote, in terms of violence, seems really important in terms of state responses, both with, with actual like representatives, but then also with the actual population. So it could actually be helpful too to kind of broaden your interviews. You kind of do some more civil society interviews and perceptions alongside security actors.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very good suggestion. Thank you.
So we had a question online, and then we'll come to you. I also have a question, or Mike has a question. I think Mike, you had your hand up, and then we'll have Mike, and then we'll have Suzanne is online. So Mike.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Pierre. This was a really fascinating presentation. And I don't work on Sahel, so this is a lot of it is new to me. I mean, I think the underlying puzzle is quite compelling, sort of variation, and I think the explanation you provided is quite plausible. So, I mean, one question is sort of thinking about the range of alternative explanations, whether your work is engaging some of this literature that comes out of political science on conflict delegation in civil wars. So when states delegate pro-state or just other militia to wage their conflicts, and when it occurs across Africa, not just with respect to campaigns against jihadist groups, right, but just other kinds of adversaries as well, right? And so, there's a lot in that literature about why why states are doing what they're doing on this. I mean, one is actually, I mean, related to the question of coups, but it is partly it's about a strategy of coup-proofing, right? So you don't want to build up your own military too much, so you delegate to some militia in the periphery to sort of handle this business. Of course, you know, civil-military relations are fraught across all of these three cases that you're talking about. So I don't know how much that's really explaining. You know, there's a question also of you know, it's interesting. You know, the more in your three cases, the more you delegate to these military or to these militia, the less effective the military response is, right? But we're talking about, you know, Ethiopia, I think, in our earlier conversation, where, you know, it was understood, you know, delegating to pro-state militia in the Somali region was more effective from the Ethiopian state's perspective, that they had local knowledge, that they could be more capable counterinsurgents, right? You know, so I mean, I wonder. There's the path dependence question that you sort of spoke about with respect to Mali. That is this historic pattern of delegating security provision to actors, right? That goes back, I imagine, decades. And is this a path dependent outcome? Mm-hmm. So I wonder sort of if this literature is sort of on the brain, and if you're thinking about engaging some of those explanations.
That's very useful too. You know, in fact, we haven't really looked at that carefully. Some of these hypotheses we have thought of, but from looking at our case, not from reading up on this. So I need to beef up on that scholarship. I tell you what, man, I'm glad that you mentioned that there's a lot there, and that there's a lot of alternative hypotheses that we definitely need to engage with. The reason why, maybe one reason why we haven't looked at it that much, is that I have a hard time with this coup-proofing hypothesis, which I'm a little bit familiar with. But when I look at coups in those regions, it doesn't strike me that if you have like a big military, a strong, well-trained military, that it changed the risk of coup whatsoever. All you need is a bunch of renegade petty officers or captains, and they take over the radio station and then the presidency. So to some extent, I even think that if you invest properly into the military, you might even remove the grievances. So because I've never felt that was such a, I never felt like it was a compelling causality. I think that kind of maybe I did not really look into it more carefully, but I realize there's probably a lot more to it than that. So I appreciate that. I might even send you an email asking for suggestions on where to start reading about this. Thank you. It's very useful.
Suzanne, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My question, I guess, feeds into what Michael was just asking, in part because I'm not a specialist in the region, but I was wondering if, given your discussion of these three cases, as political scientists, what do we learn from them about the conditions under which militia becomes so dominant and the state is weakened? And to what extent, I mean, because we have situations that are comparable to what you describe elsewhere that don't end up the same way. For instance, where the state, to win an election, will hire militia. And then, of course, you always run the risk when you do that it will get out of control and the state will lose its monopoly of legitimate force, which doesn't always happen. So I'm just wondering, because given in your conclusions, I mean, we have a lot of factors, and obviously these are very complex situations. So I just wondered if you could reflect a bit on your cases and maybe give me some thoughts on what I just asked. And what else I mean, not only what we learned from these cases, but to what extent they might apply elsewhere. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for that question. I don't know that I have an answer, but it's something to think of. So first of all, the first thing that comes to mind is that there's militia and militia. So if you look at, for example, electoral violence in Kenya, and you have the use of militias there by political parties and actors, my impression is that this is a different kind of delegation. It's a different kind of instrumentalization of identity. The militias we have here that we speak of are really groups that are steeped into local customary identities and practices, and that tend to be legitimated by customary actors, traditional chiefs, etc. And so they seem to be, I guess the use of these groups is problematic and tends to be really widely condemned. I'm much more, and I can't speak for Jessica here. It's a little bit outside of the main focus, but I'm much less inclined to be normatively critical of them. They certainly engage in violence, and they're certainly unaccountable. But you know, the military of these countries engage in violence and are unaccountable. So this is not something that differentiates them. But to some extent, they allow for a re-embedding of the state into local norms and local social fabrics, which my intuition is to look upon that somewhat favorably. And I don't mean to say that I'm favorable to these groups, right? I really am agnostic about that. But I certainly see a pattern whereby the violence threatens the state, the post-colonial state, and the post-colonial state is very weak and unable to affirm its Westphalian sovereignty. And so in the process then, when it's not able to, it resorts to actors who are historically fundamentally competitors with it. And in doing that, it sort of reinvents itself in a way that might be dysfunctional and might not produce success right now, but certainly one could hypothesize that it kind of regrows roots to a degree, or certainly maybe opens opportunities for this to happen. So this is just me improvising right now. I don't know exactly where to go with it, but I think that's.
Can I just follow up with am I allowed to, Eric?
No, it's up to Eric.
Yeah, briefly, and then we have two more questions.
No, I'm just wondering, so what you're saying is that to some extent, the state embeds itself in these groups which have more legitimacy than they might do elsewhere. And then, so are you saying then the state will actually, I mean, or at least there's the potential for these two to coalesce at some point? In other words, the militia and the state to become one. I mean, I'm not putting it very well, but I guess you know what I mean. So.
Yeah. So let me. I'm thinking out loud. So I do think there's a potential there to change the relationship between the state and other groups. In Burkina, the state is trying to reinvent itself by co-opting these. So it's weak. So it tries to rebuild on its kind of mossy root by making these guys really fundamental actors of state violence. In Mali, it's more these groups that kind of make themselves the state at the local level. So the dynamic might be a little bit different. But this is just me thinking out loud. Those are maybe dimensions to think of, but I would not speculate that there's a pattern of this happening because that's not something really we have looked at. But I like the fact that you asked that because I think we need to engage with this. Like, what does that mean in terms of, as you're saying, like, what do we learn about the conditions under which this could become like almost an equilibrium, if you will. And I think that makes it policy relevant also. So I think it behooves us to engage with that. But this is just me improvising the first level of answer.
This is kind of related to what she was asking. So if it's like not something that you can like, it's not something that you like necessarily have a thought about, feel free to ignore it. But kind of on the like relation of local like identities that are like being legitimized, do you think that the identity and recognition like of the state and the like national identity with the like state that's in place would impact how much the like that group would be able to work with the state in terms of like being able to like participate in that like state violence versus like groups who are very much like, no, like we're not a part of that. Like we don't identify with like the Mali state, we are local.
I see.
And implementing their own and like almost like getting into that like notion of like potentially a coup. And like that separation, like is that connection versus separation important in who gets to participate versus who is excluded?
So you're asking, so these groups that have local identities that might mobilize like militia violence, whether they also share the national identity in a strong way?
Like if they share that, does that make them like supposedly like more influential and more impactful, or would that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess we could probably look at Afrobarometer data to get a sense of that. People ask like would they feel more one versus the other. I haven't looked at that, but that's a good hypothesis. You imagine it might make a difference, right?
Yeah, because I feel like if you have like a higher like in areas where you're seeing a more like national identification with some sort of national identity, this is like very much very generalized, but it feels like there's less likely to be that kind of like individual fighting or like violence in where you would see the emergence of groups like the ones that we were talking about here.
Yeah, there might be more constructive outlook altogether. Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you. I will try to look into that and add that. Thank you.
I was just, if I can add to, I was
I
thinking,
can.
kind of a variation of that thinking too, is not just a sort of identification with the state, but also the expectation that the state will actually, that it'll deliver on your demands, that it can provide on your demands. I mean, I was struck, we talked very briefly about my research on Tuareg music, and, you know, I spent most of my time in Niger, but also a little bit in Mali. And it was very striking to me just in the brief experience I had in Bamako of just how different the relationships were that the people I was talking to and how they imagined the relationship to the state. And I've wondered, like in Niger, a lot of the conversation among the Tuareg community in Agada is in the north is on that road of uranium that you talked about, and people are often speaking about the need for the state to come in and rebuild that road, because if you take the bus up there, which I've done a few times, it's very harrowing. The road is in complete disrepair, and people are making these demands for the state to rebuild the road and to provide this channel to continue, uranium exploitation as a way to promote development in the region. So I'm just wondering, there's a sense still that people are turning to the state to make their appeals rather than saying necessarily coming to fight them. So I feel like that's a variation of what you were asking.
So could that be kind of how can I say this? Would that be endogenous to the question? Like to some extent, this expectation of the state might correspond to people's experience with what might correlate with the dimensions we're looking at also.
Yeah, I mean, if the demands of different groups are different, then maybe that will influence the state response as well.
So maybe also Afro-government might have stuff like that. Yeah, there's room for us to refine it at the local level in terms of dynamics. That's really helpful. I appreciate it. Let me write that down quickly. Yes.
Yeah. One more from me. I'm curious, Pierre, in the interviews you've done, is there any evidence of kind of learning between the different states or kind of feedback loops? I mean, I wonder because it's a regional problem. It's 3 countries that border one another dealing with the same or similar kinds of threats. I mean, are Nigerian elites looking at what's happened in Mali and being like, oh, that's not the strategy for us, right? Be curious.
Yes, definitely. You see it. Yes. So, like the Niger government has definitely explicitly staying away from militias, referring to the mess in central Mali. So, and they had their own experience before, but they're certainly looking at each other. And then you have the opposite also. Both Mali and Burkina established institutions in the last couple of years that are copycats of the CNESS, the Center for Strategic Studies in Niger. They did it differently. In Niger, it's attached to the presidency, so it has an impact. It's really designing strategy. In Burkina, it was attached to the Foreign Affairs Ministry. In the other one, the Prime Minister. So in countries where you have a strong centralized, personalized rule, if it's not with the president, it doesn't work as much. In Mali, almost we felt like it was imitation. It was not really learning, so it's like, oh, let's copy that. Let's do the same thing. And again, maybe this gets you some funding from the donors or something. But it seemed very hollow. Like, when you talk to people, they hadn't produced anything. Nobody was truly in charge. Whoever was in charge was not connected to the highest authorities. So there might be a process of, imitation of Niger, which seems more successful. But Niger, at least, maybe Burkina a little bit, is definitely, they're looking at Mali, and the incumbent authorities are concerned. Now, maybe after the coup in Burkina, it's different. Because certainly you can imagine that Kabore was really concerned about, not wanting to get overthrown. Mm-hmm. But now that it's over, it might be different. They might want to learn different things, right? Yeah. So now they might be learning from Wagner, like the Burkinabe might be saying, maybe we go to the Russians too. But yeah, there's definitely you live, when you're there, you are in one political economy of violence. It's really the same thing everywhere. Different sovereign actors, but everybody's engaged in the same dynamics, and everybody's looking at each other, and of course they all know each other, they all travel left and right, and it's really one space. Yeah, good point.
Well, thank you all so much. We're out of time. So with that, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us online. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for all that feedback. Very useful.